On a warm July afternoon in 1945, two brothers rode their bicycles near their home in Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan. 6-year-old Tommy Martin and his younger brother Jerry, just 2 days away from his 4th birthday, were doing what children did in those days, exploring their neighborhood, enjoying the summer breeze. A woman approached them on the sidewalk. She had a pleasant smile. She asked the boys a simple question. Would they like some candy? Tommy, the older brother, said no. But Jerry, not yet 4 years old and trusting the way young children are, said yes. The woman told Tommy to stay and watch the bicycles. She took Jerry's small hand in hers and walked away, promising to return in just a few minutes. Tommy stood there, waiting. Jerry never came back. For 74 years, Tommy Martin searched for his little brother. And in 2019, through DNA technology and a chance discovery by Jerry's own granddaughters, Tommy finally got his answer. What he learned would solve one of the longest missing person cases in American history. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and subscribe to Seek Stories for more incredible true crime cases. Hell's Kitchen in 1945 was a working-class neighborhood on Manhattan's West Side. Predominantly Irish, rough around the edges, but still a community where people knew their neighbors. That summer felt different. Germany had surrendered in May, and everyone knew the war would soon be over. Soldiers would be coming home. Gerald Martin was one of those men waiting for life to return to normal. He was a working man in his 30s, doing whatever jobs he could find, loading docks, hauling freight, fixing things in tenement buildings. He had 2 sons from his first marriage to a woman named Nancy. Thomas, born in 1939, and Gerald, born July 11th, 1941. Everyone called Gerald by his nickname, Jerry. Gerald and Nancy's marriage hadn't survived the pressures of poverty. After a bitter split, Gerald got custody of both boys. By 1945, he had started a new relationship and had a baby daughter named Mary. Tommy Martin was 6 that summer, tall for his age, with dark hair and watchful gray eyes that seemed older than 6. He was the responsible one, the kind of older brother who understood he needed to look out for Jerry. Jerry would turn 4 on July 11th. He was small for his age, wiry and quick, with light blonde hair that caught the sunlight and bright blue eyes that were almost always smiling. He had the trusting, enthusiastic nature of a very young child who hasn't learned the world can be dangerous. On July 9th, Jerry wore his favorite shirt, red and white horizontal stripes, slightly too big on his small frame, with brown shorts held up by suspenders. That afternoon, the July heat had become bearable enough for the boys to go outside. Harold's instructions were firm. Stay close to home. Stay where I can see you. And Tommy, you watch your brother. Don't let him out of your sight. I will, Dad. Tommy nodded seriously. He always understood that keeping Jerry safe was his job. The boys carried their bicycles down to the sidewalk. The street smelled like hot asphalt and cooking cabbage. Women's voices drifted from open windows above. Tommy pedaled slowly, checking over his shoulder to make sure Jerry's smaller bike with training wheels, click, 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 was keeping up. After riding for a while, they stopped on the sidewalk. That's when the woman appeared. She seemed to step out from nowhere, maybe a doorway. Maybe she'd been walking and they hadn't noticed. She was somewhere in her 30s or 40s, with dark hair pulled back, wearing a simple cotton dress with a faded floral pattern. She looked ordinary, unremarkable, like any woman from the neighborhood. "Hello, boys," she said pleasantly, her New York accent familiar. "It's such a hot day, isn't it? Would you boys like some candy?" Tommy felt something tighten in his stomach, some instinct whispering caution. "No, thank you, ma'am," he said firmly. But Jerry's face lit up. His blue eyes widened with excitement. "Yes," he said eagerly. Candy was a rare treat in the Martin household. The woman's smile grew warmer. "There's a candy store just around the corner. Why don't you come with me?" She looked at Tommy. "You stay here and watch the bicycles, sweetheart. We'll be right back. Just a few minutes." Tommy hesitated. Everything in him wanted to refuse, to grab Jerry and go home. But he was 6 years old, and she was an adult. Adults were supposed to be obeyed. "Okay," he heard himself say, though his voice sounded uncertain. The woman held out her hand. Jerry took it without hesitation, his small fingers disappearing into her palm. He looked back at Tommy and waved, grinning, excited about the candy. They walked away down the sidewalk. Jerry's red and white striped shirt was bright in the afternoon sunlight. His blonde hair gleamed. Tommy watched them reach the corner, turn, and disappear from sight. Tommy stood holding both bicycles. Around him, Hell's Kitchen continued its rhythm. Voices from windows, radio music, a truck rumbling past. Nothing had changed, except everything had changed. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The feeling in Tommy's stomach grew stronger. 15 minutes. 20. Were they? 30 minutes. Tommy couldn't wait anymore. He needed his father. He left Jerry's bicycle on its kickstand and pedaled home as fast as he could, running up the stairs 2 at a time. "Dad," he called, bursting through the door. "Dad!" Harold appeared, alarmed. "What's wrong? Where's Jerry?" The words tumbled out. A woman, Candy, she told Tommy to wait. They didn't come back. Jerry's still gone. Harold's face went pale. He grabbed Tommy by the shoulders. "Show me where." "Right now." They ran back to where Jerry's bicycle still stood waiting. Harold started walking quickly, calling Jerry's name, his voice getting louder and more desperate. "Jerry! Jerry! Gerald Martin!" There was no answer. No small blonde boy came running. The afternoon continued as if nothing had happened, and Jerry was gone. Harold Martin ran through Hell's Kitchen that afternoon, calling his son's name until his voice went hoarse. He checked every store within a 6-block radius, asking shopkeepers if they'd seen a small blonde boy wearing a red and white striped shirt, describing the woman based on Tommy's account. Nobody had seen them. Nobody remembered anything unusual. As the sun began to sink, Harold made his way to the police station, his hands shaking. "My son is missing," he said, his voice cracking. "Someone took him." The officer pulled out a form. Harold explained everything. The woman, the candy, how Jerry never came back. The officer's face was grave. Missing children were taken seriously. "Gerald Martin," Harold said. "Everyone calls him Jerry. He'll be 4 years old in 2 days. Blonde hair, very blonde. Blue eyes, small for his age. He was wearing a red and white striped shirt, brown shorts with suspenders." The police launched a search that night, combing through Hell's Kitchen, checking hospitals, train stations, bus depots. They found nothing. The next morning, the New York Daily News ran a story. 4-year-old boy missing from Hell's Kitchen. Tips came in, a woman with a blonde child on a bus, a crying child in a store. Every lead was investigated. None led to Jerry. The police developed a theory. Harold's contentious split from Nancy caught their attention. What if Nancy had arranged for someone to take Jerry? They questioned her extensively, searched her home, interviewed her friends. Nancy was distraught and indignant, denying any involvement. There was no evidence connecting her. No proof. If Nancy wasn't involved, then who was the woman? The police had only Tommy's vague description. Dark hair, floral dress, ordinary-looking, pleasant voice. In Hell's Kitchen, hundreds of women fit that description. Without a name, without witnesses who saw where they went, the police had nowhere to go. Days became weeks. The investigation continued, but leads dried up. The newspapers moved on. Harold Martin didn't. Every day he searched, walking through neighborhoods, looking at children's faces, hoping to see Jerry's blonde hair and blue eyes. He checked with police regularly. The answer was always the same. No new developments. We're still looking. But Harold could see it in their eyes. The case was going cold. Tommy carried a different burden. He was 6 when his brother disappeared. He had been the last to see Jerry. He had let Jerry go with that woman. It didn't matter that he was just a child following an adult's instructions. Tommy felt responsible. The guilt settled into him like a stone and would stay there for life. Years passed. Jerry's 4th birthday came without him. Then his 5th, his 10th. Harold never gave up believing his son was alive somewhere, that the woman had taken Jerry to raise as her own. "He's out there," Harold would say. "Jerry's out there somewhere. We'll find him." But they didn't. In 1953, when Jerry would have been 12, Harold passed away. He was only in his 40s, but life had been hard. On his deathbed, he whispered to Tommy, now a teenager, "Find him. Promise me you'll keep looking." Tommy promised. A promise he would keep for 66 years. Tommy grew up carrying that July afternoon with him. He married Mary, his half-sister from his father's second relationship. He built a life and a career. But he never forgot Jerry. He never stopped looking. As an adult, Tommy periodically checked with police, followed news stories about found missing children, kept Jerry's photograph, and wondered what his brother might look like now. Decades rolled by. Hell's Kitchen changed, gentrified. The working-class Irish families moved away. The neighborhood of Tommy and Jerry's childhood disappeared. Tommy eventually moved to Florida in his retirement. He was in his 70s now, with gray hair and those same watchful eyes. There was always that empty space where Jerry should have been. In the early 2000s, Tommy began seeing news about cold cases solved through DNA testing. Companies like 23andMe offered genetic testing, allowing people to connect with relatives. Tommy saw an opportunity. What if Jerry had taken one of these tests? What if, somewhere, there was a man in his 60s with Jerry's DNA? It was a desperate hope. But Tommy had been hoping desperately for 60-something years. In his late 70s, Tommy ordered a DNA kit from 23andMe. He swabbed his cheek, sent the sample, and activated all features to see genetic matches. Then he waited, checking regularly, hoping Jerry's name would appear. It never did. Tommy turned 80, running out of time. The chances of finding Jerry after 70 years seemed impossibly small. But Tommy kept checking, kept that promise to his father. Keep looking. Never give up. Then, in 2019, a message appeared in Tommy's inbox. It was from a woman named Cynthia. It would change everything. 10 miles south of Manhattan, in Staten Island, a completely different story had been unfolding. One that, for 74 years, had no apparent connection to the Martin family. This was the story of the Palmadesso family. Angelo Palmadesso was born to Italian immigrant parents in the early 1900s. By World War II, he was in his 30s, married to Isabel, a woman in her 40s with 2 adult daughters from a previous marriage. Angelo and Isabel had never had a child together. In 1943, Angelo was drafted. He left for Europe to fight, leaving Isabel alone in Staten Island for approximately 2 years. And then something mysterious happened. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered. Angelo would be coming home. On May 31st, 1945, just 3 weeks later, a birth certificate was issued in Staten Island for a boy named Richard Palmadesso. According to the certificate, Richard had been born on May 31st, 1943, making him exactly 2 years old. But Angelo had been overseas for 2 years. How could Isabel have given birth while her husband was fighting in Europe? This question wouldn't be asked for decades. At the time, the birth certificate was accepted without scrutiny. In September 1945, Angelo came home from war. He found Isabel waiting, and a 2-year-old boy named Richard. What Angelo was told remains unknown. Perhaps Isabel claimed she'd been pregnant when he left. Perhaps Angelo, exhausted from war, didn't ask questions. Or perhaps he knew the truth and accepted it anyway. Richard Palmadesso grew up as Angelo and Isabel's son, an Italian-American boy in Staten Island. He had blonde hair and blue eyes, unusual for someone supposedly of Italian descent, but not impossible. When Richard was 12, Isabel passed away. Angelo sent Richard to live with his Uncle Jack through his teenage years. Richard wasn't particularly close to the extended Palmadesso family. After leaving his uncle's home, he didn't maintain regular contact. In 1970, Angelo died. Richard had married by then and was starting his own family. Richard had 3 daughters, including twins Audrey and Cynthia. They grew up knowing their father as Richard Palmadesso, believing they were Italian-American with roots in Staten Island. Richard told them stories about his parents Angelo and Isabel about being Italian. But there was something about their father. Richard struggled with anxiety and what they suspected might be bipolar disorder. He had dreams he never pursued. He loved movies and acting, but never took steps toward that goal. There was something wounded about him, something that suggested deep pain he couldn't articulate. Richard loved coconut cake. He was particular about certain things, had specific quirks. His daughters loved him despite his idiosyncrasies. In 2017, Richard Palmadesso passed away. His daughters mourned him and began looking through old photographs, trying to honor his legacy by learning more about their family history. Someone suggested DNA tests. It seemed like a meaningful way to explore their father's Italian roots. Audrey and Cynthia each ordered testing kits, swabbed their cheeks, and sent samples to the lab. They waited for results, expecting confirmation of Italian ancestry. When results arrived, both sisters stared at their screens in confusion. According to the genetic analysis, they had no Italian ancestry. None, not even a trace. Their DNA showed English, Irish, German, Scottish, but no Italian heritage at all. This made no sense. Their father was Richard Palmadesso. The Palmadesso family was Italian. How could they have zero Italian DNA? They assumed it was an error. So they took another test with a different company. Then a third test. All three said the same thing, no Italian ancestry. The twins sat together, trying to make sense of these impossible results. If they weren't Italian, if they had no Palmadesso DNA, then what did that mean? Was their father adopted? They decided to test someone who should definitely share their DNA, a first cousin on their father's side. The cousin agreed. The results came back. No genetic relationship. Audrey and Cynthia were not related to this cousin at all. The implications were staggering. Their father was not a Palmadesso. He was not Angelo and Isabel's biological son. Everything they'd been told was built on a lie. But if Richard wasn't Richard Palmadesso, then who was he? Cynthia decided to activate a feature on her 23andMe account that she'd initially kept disabled. DNA matching with other people in the database. She clicked the button. Almost immediately, matches populated her results. Dozens of distant cousins. But one match stood out at the top of the list. Tom Martin, 22% DNA match. Cynthia stared at the name. She'd never heard of Tom Martin. But according to the analysis, Tom shared 22% of his DNA with her. That level meant Tom was either her grandfather or her uncle. Audrey's account showed the same result. Tom Martin, 22% match. Who was he? Why had their father never mentioned anyone named Martin? There was a messaging feature. Cynthia hovered over the button, hesitating. Once she sent this message, there would be no going back. She took a breath and clicked. Hi, Tom. My name is Cynthia. You showed up as a DNA match for me and my sister Audrey. We're trying to understand our family history, and we're surprised to see this connection. Do you have any information about how we might be related? She hit send and waited. Hours later, a response appeared. Hello, Cynthia. I'm surprised to see your message. I took this DNA test because I've been searching for my brother who went missing 74 years ago. His name was Gerald Martin. We called him Jerry. He was taken when he was almost 4 years old, in 1945, from Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. I've been looking for him my entire life. Can you tell me more about your family? Cynthia read the message 3 times before fully processing it. A brother missing since 1945. A 4-year-old boy taken from Manhattan. 74 years of searching. She wrote back quickly, telling Tom about their father, Richard Palmadesso, that he'd recently passed in 2017, about the DNA tests showing they weren't Italian, weren't related to the Palmadesso family. Tom responded, asking for photographs. Did they have pictures of Richard? Audrey and Cynthia gathered every photograph they could find. Richard as a young man, middle-aged, elderly. They sent the files to Tom. Then they waited, hearts pounding. When Tom's message came, it was simple but earth-shattering. I think your father was my brother Jerry. The sisters sat in silence, staring at those words. Their father, Jerry Martin, the little blonde boy who vanished 74 years ago. Tom sent photographs of himself, of his family, of old pictures of Jerry from before the disappearance. The Martin family resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of the face, the eyes, the smile. Looking at young Tom was like looking at their father. Over the next days and weeks, they exchanged messages, phone calls, photographs. They compared notes about Richard and what Tom remembered about Jerry. They looked at the timeline. Jerry taken in July 1945, Richard's birth certificate issued in May 1945 claiming he was born in May 1943. The pieces fit like a terrible puzzle. Richard's birth certificate was clearly fraudulent. If it claimed he was born in May 1943, he would have been 2 years old in May 1945. But Jerry Martin was almost 4 in July 1945, which matched if the birth certificate had aged him down by about 2 years. And there were other connections, small details that seemed impossibly coincidental. Tom loved coconut cake. Richard had loved coconut cake. Tom had dreamed of being an actor, loved movies. Richard shared those exact dreams and interests. Tom had a particular personality, kind, gentle, specific humor. People who knew Richard described him almost identically. These weren't just genetic relatives. These were two people who, despite being raised in completely different environments by different families, shared deep similarities in tastes, dreams, and fundamental nature. The evidence was compelling, but circumstantial. To prove definitively that Richard was Jerry, they needed direct DNA comparison. But Richard had passed away and been cremated. There was no body to exhume. However, they had the next best thing: Tom's DNA and Richard's daughter's DNA. If Tom and Richard were brothers, Tom would show as an uncle to Richard's children, sharing approximately 22% of DNA with them, which was exactly what the test showed. The mathematical probability was overwhelming. Tom Martin was the uncle of Audrey and Cynthia. Their father, Richard Palmadesso, was Tom's brother, Gerald Jerry Martin. The little boy who vanished on July 9th, 1945, had been found at last. Once the initial shock wore off, they began trying to understand what actually happened. How did Jerry Martin, age almost 4, kidnapped from Hell's Kitchen, end up as Richard Palmadesso in Staten Island? The timeline was suspicious. Germany surrendered May 7th, 1945. Angelo would be coming home. On May 31st, a birth certificate was issued for Richard Palmadesso, claiming he'd been born May 31st, 1943, making him 2 years old. But Angelo had been overseas for 2 years. If Richard had really been born in May 1943, Isabel would have been pregnant when Angelo left, would have given birth while he was gone. Yet there was no evidence Isabel had ever been pregnant. No letters mentioning it, no hospital records, no witnesses. The birth certificate appeared completely fabricated. 6 weeks after that certificate was issued, on July 9th, 1945, Jerry Martin was kidnapped. A woman offered him candy, took his hand, and walked away while Tommy waited. 10 miles separated Hell's Kitchen and Staten Island. 10 miles across the water, close enough to travel in under an hour, far enough to be different worlds. Was Isabel Palmadesso the woman who took Jerry? The theory fits disturbingly well. Isabel was in her 40s in 1945, matching Tommy's memory of the woman being not young, but not old. Isabel had motive: a husband returning from war, a need to present him with a son, pressure to cement their family with a child they'd never conceived. And the timing: just 6 weeks after obtaining a fraudulent birth certificate for a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old boy disappeared. If you wanted to pass off a 4-year-old as 2, you'd need a small child. Jerry was described by everyone as small for his age, wiry, and slight. A 4-year-old who might plausibly pass for 2. But why take a 4-year-old? Women who stole children typically wanted infants. Infants couldn't talk, couldn't remember their real families. A 4-year-old was a risk. A 4-year-old had memories, could tell people his real name, could potentially identify his kidnapper. How did Isabel deal with that problem? Perhaps she told Jerry his real family didn't want him, that she was his new mother now. Children that young are malleable, especially isolated from anyone who might contradict the story. Perhaps she used kindness or fear to keep him compliant. Perhaps she simply repeated the lie until Jerry, confused and overwhelmed, began believing it. Or perhaps the trauma caused Jerry to suppress his own memories. The human mind, especially a child's, has remarkable defense mechanisms. If remembering causes too much pain, the mind can choose to forget, burying memories deep while leaving only vague unease. Richard Palmadesso was, by all accounts, anxious throughout his life. He struggled with suspected bipolar disorder. He had a sense of disconnection, of not quite fitting in. Could this have been buried trauma? Could his mental health struggles have resulted from being kidnapped at 4 and forced to live under a false identity? We'll never know for certain. Isabel died in 1955 when Richard was 12, taking her secrets to the grave. Angelo died in 1970. Richard died in 2017, possibly never consciously remembering he'd been Jerry Martin. But the evidence points in one direction: the fraudulent birth certificate, the timing of Jerry's disappearance, the age manipulation, the physical resemblance, the DNA proof that Richard was Jerry. The distance, 10 miles, close enough for Isabel to travel to Manhattan, identify a target, and return to Staten Island in one afternoon. Could Isabel have acquired Jerry through a black market rather than kidnapping him herself? It's possible. During the late 40s and early 50s, a black market for children existed. Corrupt doctors and lawyers trafficked stolen children to desperate couples. But black market rings typically dealt in infants, not 4-year-olds. And the timing, just 6 weeks after Isabel obtained a certificate, suggests more direct connection. The simplest explanation: Isabel needed a son to present to Angelo. She created a fraudulent birth certificate. 6 weeks later, a 4-year-old matching the age Richard should have been disappeared from 10 miles away. That boy ended up being raised as Richard Palmadesso. The conclusion seems inescapable. Isabel, or someone acting for her, took Jerry Martin and turned him into Richard Palmadesso. For Audrey and Cynthia, understanding this meant reframing everything about their father. Richard hadn't been Italian. He hadn't been born in Staten Island. He'd been a stolen child, kidnapped at 4, separated from his real family, forced to live a lie for his entire life. It explains so much. The anxiety, the disconnection, the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Richard had been living with buried trauma for 7 decades. Trauma he probably didn't consciously remember, but that shaped his personality and mental health. For Tom Martin, the revelation was bittersweet. He'd searched for Jerry for 74 years. He'd kept his promise to his father, never given up hope. And now, finally, he had his answer. Jerry had been alive. Jerry had lived a full life, married, had children and grandchildren. Jerry's life had mattered, but Jerry was gone. He'd passed away in 2017, just 2 years before the DNA match was discovered. Tom had been so close. If they connected a few years earlier, the brothers could have met. They could have talked. Tom could have told Jerry about their father Gerald, about their childhood, about Tommy waiting with the bicycles and never forgiving himself. Instead, Tom would never see his brother again. He would never get to look into Jerry's eyes, adult to adult, and have a conversation they should have had decades earlier. All Tom had were photographs. Pictures of Richard at various ages, living as Richard Palmadesso. Pictures showing a man who looked remarkably like the Martin family, who was undeniably Jerry even though he'd never known it. And Tom had his nieces. Audrey, Cynthia, and their sister Stephanie welcomed Tom with open arms. They wanted to know about their father's real family. They wanted to understand where they truly came from. The families met in person. Tom and his wife, Mary, traveled to meet the sisters. They shared meals, looked through albums, told stories about Richard and Jerry, and the Martin family history the sisters never knew existed. For the first time in 74 years, pieces of the Martin family were reunited. They celebrated Thanksgiving together. They talked for hours, discovering shared traits and preferences that transcended years of separation. The sisters learned they were part Irish, not Italian. They learned about Hell's Kitchen in the 40s. They learned about Gerald Martin, the grandfather they never knew, who searched for his son until his dying day. Tom learned about Jerry's life as Richard. He learned his brother had been a good father, had been loved by his children, had built something meaningful even while living under a false identity. It was a comfort, knowing Jerry hadn't been alone, hadn't been unloved, hadn't suffered continuously. But there was also anger. Anger at Isabel Palmadesso. Anger at the injustice of a 4-year-old taken from his family and never returned. Anger at years stolen, at the relationship between brothers severed on a summer afternoon and never restored. And there was sadness for all the lost time. 74 years. Most of a lifetime. Tom and Jerry could have grown up together, supported each other through life's challenges, watched each other's children grow up, grown old together. Instead, they got 10 miles of separation and 74 years of silence. Richard and Tom had lived near each other for years. Staten Island is only 10 miles from Manhattan. They might have passed each other on the street, stood in the same store, sat in the same restaurant, ridden the same subway, completely unaware they were brothers. If someone had known, if someone had told, if Isabel had confessed, if Angelo had revealed the truth, if Richard had somehow accessed his buried memories, any of these could have reunited the brothers while both were alive. But it didn't happen. The truth stayed hidden until after Richard was gone. The story of Jerry Martin and Richard Palmadesso raises questions that extend beyond one family's tragedy. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how many children went missing in the mid-20th century, how easy it was to create false identities, how trauma can be buried so deep the victim doesn't even remember their own victimization. How many other children from that era were stolen and never found? How many other families spent decades searching for sons and daughters living just miles away under different names? How many others lived entire lives not knowing their true identities, carrying buried trauma they couldn't explain? We'll never have complete answers. The infrastructure for tracking missing children didn't exist in 1945 like it does now. No national database, no Amber Alert, no internet where a child's face could be shared across the country in seconds. When a child went missing, the search was limited to local efforts and whatever newspaper coverage the case generated. Birth certificates weren't rigorously verified. If someone presented a certificate, officials generally accepted it. This created opportunities to create false identities accepted by schools, hospitals, government agencies, and society at large. The case highlights the lasting impact of childhood trauma, even trauma not consciously remembered. Richard struggled with anxiety and apparent mental health issues throughout life. Could this have resulted from being kidnapped at 4? Could his subconscious have retained memories his conscious mind suppressed? Could the fundamental wrongness of living under a false identity have manifested as a psychological distress, even if he couldn't articulate why? Psychologists studying childhood trauma have documented that experiences from early childhood, even those we don't consciously remember, can shape our personalities and mental health for life. A child experiencing severe trauma before age 5 may not retain explicit memories, but the trauma leaves its mark, affecting how we form attachments, perceive safety and danger, navigate the world. If Richard was Jerry, and DNA proves he was, then he experienced profound trauma at 4. He was taken from his father and brother, separated from everything familiar, told he was someone he wasn't, forced to accept a new identity, family, and reality. Even if his conscious mind eventually accepted he was Richard Palmadesso, his unconscious mind would have known something was wrong. That knowledge, buried deep, could have been the source of lifelong anxiety and mental health struggles. For the families, the revelation brought both closure and new pain. Tom finally knew what happened to his brother. After 74 years of searching, wondering, hoping, he had his answer. Jerry had lived, been relatively close by much of his life, built a family, and left a legacy. That knowledge was precious, even though it came too late for reunion. Audrey, Cynthia, and Stephanie gained a family they never knew existed. They learned their true ancestry, connected with an uncle who welcomed them with love, gained understanding about their father's struggles and why he'd seemed slightly disconnected. But they also had to grapple with difficult truths. Their father had been a victim of terrible crime. He'd lived his entire life not knowing his true identity. He died before the truth could be revealed. There was grief in that realization, anger at the injustice, sorrow for lost time and lost connections. And there was the question of Isabel Palmadesso. If she was the kidnapper, and circumstantial evidence strongly suggests she was never held accountable. She died in 1955, decades before anyone discovered what she'd done. There was no justice in the legal sense, just an old woman taking her secrets to the grave. The Martin case demonstrates how DNA technology has revolutionized cold case investigation. Without consumer DNA testing, this case would never have been solved. Tom could have searched the rest of his life and never found his brother. Richard's daughters would never have learned their father's true identity. The families would have remained separated forever. But because Audrey and Cynthia took DNA tests, because Tom had registered his DNA, because the technology existed to match their profiles, the truth finally emerged. A 74-year-old mystery was solved. A stolen child was identified. A family was partially reunited, at least in understanding, if not in person. What would Jerry have thought if he'd learned the truth while alive? Would it have been relief to finally understand why he always felt disconnected? Would it have been traumatic to learn his entire childhood was a lie? Would he have wanted to know? Or preferred to continue believing he was Richard Palmadesso? We'll never know. That opportunity was lost when Richard passed in 2017, just 2 years before the DNA match was discovered. Tom Martin kept his promise to his father. He never stopped looking. And 74 years after that July afternoon in Hell's Kitchen, his persistence was rewarded. Not with the reunion he dreamed of, but with knowledge, with certainty, with the ability to finally say, I found him. I know what happened. Jerry was real. Jerry existed. Jerry mattered. And for a man who'd spent his entire life searching, that knowledge, bittersweet as it was, meant everything. In the summer of 2019, exactly 74 years after Jerry Martin disappeared from Hell's Kitchen, his true identity was confirmed through DNA evidence. The 4-year-old boy who vanished while his brother Tommy watched had been found at last. Not as a lost child, but as a man who lived a full life under another name. Tom Martin, at 80 years old, got to meet his brother's daughters. He got to see photographs spanning decades of Jerry's life as Richard Palmadesso. He got to hear stories about the man his brother became, about Richard's dreams and struggles, about the family Jerry built without ever knowing his true identity. It wasn't the reunion Tom spent 74 years hoping for, but it was something. It was truth after a lifetime of questions. It was closure after decades of uncertainty. Richard Palmadesso's daughters learned their father had been kidnapped as a young child, raised under a false identity, and lived his entire life not knowing his real name or biological family. They gained an uncle, Tom, who welcomed them with open arms. They learned their true ancestry and gained new understanding about their father's lifelong struggles with anxiety and displacement. The woman who took Jerry that day in July 1945 was never definitively identified. If it was Isabel Palmadesso, she passed away in 1955 without ever being held accountable. Justice, in a legal sense, was never achieved. But in another sense, justice prevailed. The truth emerged. The lies were exposed. Gerald Jerry Martin got his name back, even if posthumously. And 2 families, separated by crime and deception for 3/4 of a century, were finally connected through knowledge and DNA. This story reminds us that technology can solve mysteries that once seemed impossible. That persistence can lead to answers even after decades of silence. That the bonds of family, though they can be hidden and denied for generations, cannot be completely destroyed. And that behind every cold case, every missing person report, every old photograph of a lost child, there are real people who continue searching, continue hoping, continue believing that somehow, someday, the truth will come to light. Sometimes after 74 years, it does. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Seek Stories for more deep dives into true crime cases that change lives. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. And remember, somewhere, someone might be searching for answers to a decades-old mystery. Your DNA, your knowledge, your willingness to help might be the key that finally brings them home. Thank you for watching.